21. May 1945. Kassel Nord, the shattered ramp that once lifted cars onto Autobahn. 7. In a cheap army-issue notebook scavenged from a depot, a man who no longer wore a uniform wrote a prohibited sentence. He wrote it in pencil. He wrote it small, and then he crossed it out and wrote it again. He wrote, "We knew enough, and we chose bread over truth." The line could not have been spoken. Not to the American lieutenant whose jeep idled above the rubble and whose interpreter translated in clipped, precise phrases. Not to the Trümmerfrauen across the road who formed a human chain and moved bricks like rosary beads. Not to the returning men who gathered under bridges waiting for ration queues to open. It could not be spoken because it made a claim about knowledge and hunger and choice. And in May 1945, in the American zone of occupation, the language for that claim existed only in interrogation reports and the hushed pages of private notebooks. His name, in the surviving fragments, is Carl A. The initial is what remains in denazification files, in a Spruchkammer listing in Hesse, and in a housing office ledger written in blue-black ink. He had fought somewhere between the Don and the Vistula. He had lost a piece of frost-bitten ear and the ability to sleep in a bed. He had a hometown printed on a Wehrpass that fell into a ditch in Hungary. He became a tramp on the Autobahn because the Autobahn was the only line that seemed to lead toward a future. He walked the median. He slept in culverts. He learned the arithmetic of American cigarettes: 2 lucky strikes for a potato, 4 for a slice of sausage, 10 for a ride in a truck. The city he looked down on from the broken ramp had been a factory for locomotives, then for tanks, then for targets. Kassel had been burned in the autumn of 1943 and pounded again in 1944, and the surviving buildings stood like teeth in a ruined jaw. Allied occupation reports compare it to a volcanic landscape of brick and ash. Municipal archives show a housing stock reduced by more than half. The mathematics of shelter was raw. 30 families in a schoolhouse, 4 in a single parlor. A wall made of wardrobes, a window repaired with wax paper. A curfew began with the evening whistle. The proclamations were posted in heavy Gothic type, then reprinted in neat sans serif by the military government. No movement after 9 p.m. No weapons. Turn in radios. Turn in party flags. The Ordnungspolizei vanished and then returned in American helmets. The line between conquered and occupier was a line drawn across a street. The Americans drove 6x6 trucks bearing cases of K rations. The Germans stood in line and gave their names and ages and former occupations. There were frightened men who had never been frightened before. There were women who were no longer surprised. He wrote, "I thought if I keep moving I will not have to explain." The Autobahn was built to cut through explanation. In the first summer, the mathematics of food ruled every gesture. Allied intelligence summaries counted calories with the same relentless precision they had once counted tank factories. The British zone reported 1,050 calories per day in July. The American zone edged to 1,450 when transport lines reopened. The Soviet zone recorded numbers, and the numbers then disappeared. Rations were bread, dried peas, occasionally a piece of fat that smelled of the war. The 1945 harvest was poor. The 1946 harvest would be worse. The hunger winter would take its name from a season when potatoes rotted in the ground and coal froze in wagons. He wrote in September, "When you stand in lines, the hours have no politics." Friedrichstrasse, Wilhelmshohe Allee. Names turned into chalk marks on the backs of coats in a ration queue. In the ruins, there were women with bandanas tied tight over their hair and hands swollen from carrying broken bricks. Trümmerfrauen. They pried rebar from concrete with bare fingers. They formed chains and passed a small republic of stones to the edge of the road. They filled out forms for a handful of additional coupons. The mathematics of rubble looked like a prayer but was only labor. Bundesarchiv photographs show them smiling sometimes, and people would later build a myth out of those smiles. The reality, written in the brittle paper of municipal work ledgers, is hours and hours and hours at 48 Reichsmarks a week, then in Rentenmark, then in nothing at all. And the men? Many were still missing. There were 11 million German prisoners of war in Allied custody in the spring of 1945, according to the Allied Control Council. Those in the East would not return for years, if at all. Those in the West came in waves, gaunt and silent, and immediately absorbed by the ration lines. Missing family members were posted on boards near churches. Notes pinned to tree trunks in neat old handwriting, seeking Hans P., last seen in April. Seeking Lotte S. from Königsberg. A system of hope tried to impose order on the mathematics of disappearance. He kept moving. He walked the shoulder of the Autobahn as convoys passed. He learned to recognize British lorries and American deuce-and-a-halfs by sound. He slept in culverts with other men and an entire grammar of silence. He did not ask for names, he did not give his. The interzones, the US and British and Soviet lines where guardhouses monitored identity, were traps for anyone without papers. He had found a line of asphalt that could be traversed at night when the curfew only made a deeper kind of dark. He became a tramp on the Autobahn because the Autobahn was indifferent. Occupation reports described the menace of vagrants, of Waffen-SS holdouts, of werewolves, who would never materialize as a meaningful force, but would leave a residue of anxiety and occasional murders. Karl is not in any report like that. He is in the files that list transport irregulars and persons without fixed abode, men who moved between towns and were given one meal and told to move on. He did not steal from houses, he did steal from trains. He would adjust the mathematics of his guilt by writing that he stole only food. The first time he stood under a sheet hung in a burned-out cinema to watch a film that documented the camps, he did not stay for the whole reel. In June 1945, the Americans showed atrocity films in German towns, and they made attendance compulsory for selected audiences. In Kassel, in Frankfurt, in Marburg, in the Labor Exchange Hall, selected male citizens watched bulldozers pushing emaciated figures into mass graves. The projector rattled. The room smelled of damp wool. The film was something that did not fit into the arithmetic of a man trying to survive on the shoulder of an Autobahn. He wrote, "We walked past the chimneys when we were sent east and said that it was factory smoke." He wrote, "We can measure the weight of a potato. We cannot measure what is in these pictures." Denazification began with paper. It began with a form called a Fragebogen, 31 questions on party membership and insignia and offices held. It began with a law of categories: Hauptschuldig, belastet, mitlastet, mitlastet, entlastet, the severe offenders, the less burdened, the followers, the exonerated. You filled in the boxes. You listed the organizations. You waited while Allied officers and German clerks built a new bureaucracy out of ash. Karl could not fill out the form without papers. In the summer of 1946, he tried to obtain a Spruchkammer hearing in Kassel. The record, a crinkled carbon copy from the Hessian main chamber, exists in a Bundesarchiv file. It is a page and a half. It records his age. It records his last known employment as a mechanic's assistant at a machine works. It notes his Wehrmacht rank, Jeffritter. It notes that he joined no party, no SA, no SS. It notes that he paid dues to the Deutsches Arbeitsfront because one paid dues to the DAF if one worked. It notes 2 witnesses, a woman who had managed ration cards at the machine works and a man who had a shop that no longer existed. The woman said he kept to himself. The man said he was often away. Spruchkammer verdict Mitläufer, a follower. No jail. No ban on employment beyond the general ban on managerial posts. The mathematics of guilt reduced to a stamp and a category that could not possibly capture a life. The system needed stability more than thorough justice. That sentence is not in any Allied directive. It is written between the lines of the numbers. Approximately 3.6 million people were processed in the American zone, and the overwhelming majority were labeled Mitläufer or Entlastet. The courts of guilt were overwhelmed by affidavits. They were also undermined by the practical need to reopen offices with people who knew how to keep records. The mathematics of administration is as unforgiving as the mathematics of hunger. You can either fire every man with a party badge and watch the payrolls crash and the sewage back up, or you can change the files and find a way to move forward. There is a word that then did quiet work, Persilschein, a certificate of whiteness named for a brand of soap. An affidavit from a respected citizen that could scrub the grey from a record. In Carl's file, there is a small square of paper written on a typewriter with an uneven ribbon. It reads, "The named is not political. He is a reliable and industrious worker. I vouch for him." Signed, the foreman of a shop that was a crater when the note was written. The note is a lie. It is also, in a narrow sense, true. It is part of the math that got the machine to restart. He left the highway when he was told he could work. He took a job with the road department because he already knew the underpasses and the ditches. He worked out of a shed near Sandershausen, where there was a cache of orange paint and a stack of shovels. He patched potholes. He collected steel from the shoulders. He learned to translate orders written first in English by an engineer from Omaha and then in German by a city clerk from Marburg. He slept on a straw mattress in a room he shared with an ex-Beli family from Silesia. 4 people assigned to the room by the housing office, their names entered next to his in blue ink. The ledger, Städtisches Wohnungsamt Kassel, 1947, shows handwriting that grows smaller as more names are added. The arithmetic of scarce rooms is brutal. It makes enemies of people who could otherwise have been friends. The ex-Belis arrived in convoys. They came by train and by foot from Königsberg, Breslau, Brunn. They came from farms and cities and the edges of maps. Between 12 and 14 million ethnic Germans moved west in 1945 to 1947, when East Prussia, Pomerania and Silesia were lost to a redrawn Europe. They had one suitcase and a towel rolled tight in a strap and a pot. They had frostbitten children and grandparents who had seen too much change. They had keys to houses they would never see again. The mathematics of forced movement is as mechanical as a train schedule. You allot seats in a cattle car. You allot rooms in a school. You allot a kilogram of flour per person. And then you tell the locals to make room in apartments that have already had their doors kicked in by fire. Tensions are recorded in the tidy hand of policemen. "Thieves," the locals said. "Thieves," the ex-Belis said in return. Who arrived first? Who had more right to a bed? The arithmetic of grievance is not solved by dividing a single room by 5. Carl wrote, "They turned our hallway into a border." He wrote, "The child of the Silesian family had a cough like a dog." He wrote, "She liked to sleep next to the radiator, and we had to pretend that the radiator was ours." He wrote, "In the evenings, the mother told stories about a river called the Oder. We began to think we had grown up on its banks." In the DP camps, the members of the previous world gathered. Displaced persons, a phrase that made the survivor into a category. They were Jews from Poland and the former Soviet Union who had outlived nearly all their families. They were forced laborers from Ukraine and Italy and France who had been shipped to German factories at 17 and 21 and made to run lathes for munitions they did not believe in. They were prisoners of war and prisoners of a different kind. They were protected by Allied law and maintained outside German rationing and outside German rationing and outside German municipal control. The camps were often on the outskirts of German towns, on former Wehrmacht bases, on the edge of airfields whose runways were cracked and listing. Near Kassel, there were camps at Rothwesten and Zierenhain, and to the south at Frankfurt-Zielsheim, where a city of barracks included schools and newspapers and police. Allied intelligence summaries note tensions between Germans and DPs. Markets developed on the perimeters. There were complaints about stolen chickens. There were reports of DPs, particularly those with American cigarettes and army scrip, setting prices that Germans could not match. There were also accounts in oral histories of German women who brought bread to the fence and placed it on the ground and walked away. Karl walked past Zielsheim once. He had an errand to Frankfurt to fetch a load of paint and stencils for road signs. He wore a jacket issued by the road department. He had a stamped pass. He walked past the gate, and on the fence, someone had nailed a sign with Hebrew letters. He did not know the letters. He noted only that they looked like a music not meant for his ears. He wrote that the faces inside belonged to a different war. He wrote that he stood and watched a boy fly a kite made of newsprint and thin wood slats. He wrote, "We made his wind." Contact with what had been done in their name rarely occurred as revelation. It occurred as static. A comment in a grocery line. A testimony in a courtroom reported in a small box in the local paper. A story that ran along the tables of a beer hall but stopped when a stranger walked in. Germans were shown films, and some wept, and some turned away, and some got up and left because the mathematics of suffering in the room could not bear any more numbers. In interviews captured by Allied teams in 1946, many Germans say, "We did not know." Many say, "We could not speak." A few say, "We knew, but we could not find a way to live with the knowledge and also gather wood." Many construct a new arithmetic, the bombs, the rapes, the hunger. Our suffering and theirs placed on a scale calibrated for self-rescue. Karl's notes are small and stubborn. He writes not as a confessor nor as a lawyer, but as a man trying to balance sums. He writes, "I saw the transport by the yard near the town of Lublin." He writes, "They said it was for labor." He writes, "We did not ask because asking did not bring cigarettes." He writes, "When the Americans came, they asked their own questions, and we gave them answers that would let us go home." He writes, "And there was no home." He found one kind of home in the office of the road department. The titles changed in 1947 and again in 1948. What had been managed by the Ortsgruppe became the domain of the city office that took directives from a German man who took directives from an American man with a bar on his shoulder. The files grew. The pen nibs were replaced. The currency changed, and the files recording the change had their own number series. Money began to mean something else on 20 June 1948. West of the boundary, in the Bezone, a currency reform took the old Reichsmark notes and made them paper with no value. A certain number of Deutsche Mark were handed out in packets in schoolhouses and municipal halls. 50 marks for each man and woman and child. Old money could be exchanged at punishing rates. Savings became statements of foolishness. The black market collapsed because money regained a function. Cigarettes lost their divine status in that economy. Prices were freed, and within weeks, shops that had been empty arranged goods in their windows. "The revival is astonishing," a British officer wrote in his weekly report from Kassel. "One sees people looking at sausages, not as memory, but as object." The Marshall Plan. The European Recovery Programme was announced a year earlier. But it was in 1948 and 1949 that crates stenciled with initials began to stack in depots: ERP, Fuel ERP, Milk, ERP, matching. The shipments to Western Germany had been contested. They came nonetheless, and the numbers mattered. Coal to warm rooms that had been warmed by pyres. Machines to build other machines. The mathematics of supply and demand, interrupted by war and ideology, began to again resemble the bulimic rhythms of capital. In the American files under O.M. Gus Office of Military Government, United States, there are memos that speak of productivity, of what the raw should deliver, of how many machine tools a factory in Kassel should run each day. The factory across the river where he had once tightened bolts on locomotives had changed names and products. Henschel and Son made tanks. It made locomotives again. It began to make trucks in 1949. It filed new safety rules. It hired back men who had twisted out of the damp, disappeared years. It hired at wages that looked like justice. It hired at levels that looked like justice. It hired at levels that looked like forgetting. It hired Carl for a while to work on a crew that painted markings on the lot, then to repair an assembly line's conveyor, then to fill in as a timekeeper. He discovered that he had a talent for paper. He discovered that his hand with a pen was steadier than his hand with a wrench. He also discovered that the new democracy that rebuilt itself around him was made of bargains that would not fit on a form. The mayor had been a party member. So had the head of police. So had the schoolmaster who greeted his son in a classroom where the maps had been changed, but the chalk felt exactly the same in the teacher's hand. The mathematics of stability required continuity. The men most skilled at running files had learned their craft in the previous regime. If you replaced them all, you replaced knowledge. If you kept them, you kept a silence. In Parliament, Konrad Adenauer spoke of the need to move forward. On the street in Kassel, people said, "We cannot always be looking back into our soup." In the files, the shift is recorded as law. In 1951, the Bundestag passed Article 31, the so-called 131er Gesetz, a law permitting the reinstatement of public employees who had been dismissed in post-war purges. The arithmetic of bureaucracy was given a statute: you may return. The numbers of those who returned can be calculated in reports and budgets. What cannot be added is the volume of air displaced by silence. In the schools, the social studies books devoted a chapter to 1933-1945. It was often a list of dates and a passive voice. Parties were dissolved. People were persecuted. Poisonous ideology ruled. Bombs fell. Rations were cut. Expellees arrived. This was the language of a country easing itself out of a binding. Commemorations were held in the 1950s for civilian victims of air raids. Crosses were planted for the lost of Silesia. Speeches remembered suffering. A phrase took hold: Stunde 00 hour. The myth said that one could begin anew, that time had cut a clean line and one could step across it. The reality is that history rode invisible, on the backs of all the people in line. He wrote, "My son returns home with a workbook where Hitler is a black and white picture with a caption that says, 'Dictator.'" He wrote, "He told me the teacher said that we must be grateful for democracy and for the Americans." He wrote, "I am grateful for the flower and for the American who gave me a cigarette on the day of the rain." He wrote, "I am grateful for the pension I will one day collect." He wrote, "I do not know how to tell him that I am also grateful for silence." The DP camps emptied slowly. Zilsheim closed in 1950. Rothwestern became a base for planning Germany's own currency reform and later housed other American operations. Those who survived left for Israel, for the United States, for Canada, for Australia. Those who did not want to leave remained migrants within a country that had remade itself by running over the old paths with asphalt. The rest of life adjusted itself accordingly. A Jewish survivor encountered in an oral history from Frankfurt spoke of two worlds that ran parallel in those years and only sometimes intersected. We could shop at the same market. We could live on the same street. But we could live on the same street. The Cold War swept through the spaces where memory might have taken root. The Berlin blockade began in June 1948 and ended in May 1949. Planes flew in flour and fuel and chocolate and propaganda, and the new arithmetic drew a line over the old. East and West, socialism and market, loyalty and trajectory. In West Germany, suspicion hardened into policy. Ex-party members could be reborn as anti-communists. The mathematics of allegiance allowed for conversions so long as the labels were correct on the boxes. Occupation reports speak less of guilt and more of reliability. The files of Allied counterintelligence show former Nazis hired as informants and as administrators in projects aimed at the new enemy. The front had changed direction. The weapons were different. The lines on the map had new colors. He watched the new colors. He watched the new uniforms arrive in 1955. The Bundeswehr recruited veterans and boys. He watched a woman in the housing office who had once stamped ration cards, now stamp reinstatement papers. He watched the expellees mark down payments on houses in new developments named for trees and for mountains that had never been on their horizons. He watched the first refrigerators appear in windows on Königstrasse. He helped lift one from a truck and wiped his hands on his trousers and looked at the white gloss under the sun and thought about how cold can be a luxury as well as a punishment. He also watched the veterans with no medals show up at the welfare office. The men who had been too late to fight, too early to avoid capture. The men who had been in Soviet camps and had learned to be quiet to survive. The men who had learned to be quiet before that. The mathematics of disability and loss are bureaucratic, a percentage added to a pension, a paper stamped with an assessment of the body. How much hearing remains? How much of a hand? How much of a man? In 1952, the Luxembourg Agreement was signed, and West Germany promised payments to Israel and to individual Jewish survivors. Lines of money crossed maps that could not be redrawn. The checks did not fix a single story. They did not speak in the voices of the dead. They did not ease the weight of the living who had to carry a sense of having been a neighbor to the unnameable. But they entered the arithmetic of a family's meals and were an attempt to make math stand for morality. The attempt failed at the level of meaning. It succeeded at the level of bureaucracy, which is where nations live most of their days. Karl found himself in middle age as a man who knew how to fill out forms. He became a clerk in the housing office because a man retired and because he could write a neat line. He sat behind a counter where people came to accuse and plead. They came to say that the widow down the hall had no right to that extra room. They came to say that their cousin had arrived from the east and needed beds. They came to speak of marriages that had dissolved on an Autobahn, of husbands who returned and then left again, of sons who had moved to the Ruhr because a factory had offered something public, called opportunities, and something private, called forgetting. A denazification file followed him to that desk. It was required for employment. He kept it in a drawer. It contained the paper that said he was a follower and not a leader. It contained a thin eraser mark where he had once written something that might have been inconvenient. It contained a white certificate that said he could be trusted. It contained dates that told a story that was true and also untrue. He opened the drawer sometimes and ran his thumb along the top of the folder. He considered the mathematics of where to leave the folder when he went to lunch. He never left it out. People told their stories at the counter. "We fled in January 1945, said a woman with hair like rope. "We lost everything," said a man with a broken thumbnail. "We were bombed out," said another. If he asked them where from, they said, "Königsberg, Gleiwitz, Hanover." If he asked them the year, they answered 45, and sometimes 45, and sometimes 43. The numbers were shorthand. Sometimes they were a refusal. The years in which someone had worn a uniform or a badge were not years you brought to a counter with a clerk whose own ears were still adjusted to the whine of the sirens. There were moments when the world did not allow itself to be tidied. A former forced labourer came to the counter with a certificate and a letter that said he was entitled to a room. He wore an old coat that had been too big for him once and had grown into him. He spoke German better than most of the Germans in the line. He had a piece, like a kind of armour. The people in the line looked at the certificate and looked away. Carl stamped the letter with a date and put it in the in-tray. He thought of the film in June 1945 and the way that bulldozer had moved like a slow animal under an indifferent sky. There was also the black market that persisted after the reform. The exchange of one thing for another, that is the hidden life of any economy. A man named T, who had once worn a black uniform, now wore a blue suit and had a new job as a man who made arrangements. He came to Carl's counter one morning with a bouquet of violets for the woman in the next room and a smile that was like a hat worn indoors. He spoke of how winter would be hard and how children needed wood, and how bad it would be if a family with 2 children wasted heat in a large room. He made a remark about gratitude. Carl stamped the form and returned it to him without looking at his eyes. He had learned a different arithmetic, a set of cancellations that allowed you to do your job and hold your stomach inside your coat. There were also laughter and small joys that did not require ideology. A youth football club formed in 1950 on a field cleared of twisted metal. The mothers of expellees and the mothers of those who had stayed shared recipes for vinegar cake. The city built a swimming pool out of the concrete from a collapsed bunker. The first department store window with colored dresses turned passers-by into citizens of a different country, one that spoke in displays and in the monthly plan to buy a radio. The men in hats stood with hands in their pockets and felt their chests climb and fall with a new kind of time. The Cold War present continued to shape the way the past could be addressed. In 1953, workers in East Berlin rose and were answered by tanks. The shock traveled along telephone lines to the west. "We must hold the line," said Adenauer. Holding the line meant not pulling at threads. It meant postponing certain trials indefinitely. In the courts, prosecutors considered cases from the war years and weighed the likelihood of conviction in a society that had built a defense against its own hard questions. A handful of high-profile trials occurred in the 1960s. Before then, what happened mainly in the fitful evenings of men who drank too much and then said a single sentence and then shut down like a door. He wrote, "The truth is a house I visit at night and do not enter. I look at it from across the street. I see the light in the kitchen where a woman moves a kettle onto a stove. I see a child's jacket thrown on a chair. I stand and smoke, and I do not knock. The mathematics of this visit are obvious. 1 + 1 is 2. The older I get, the less I understand. If he had a wife, she is not in the surviving papers. If he had children, one appears in a school enrollment ledger, A.J., born 1940. An entry in 1951 shows him attending a school on the edge of the city. A later line records the boy's apprenticeship at a machine shop. There are no personnel files that confirm it, but it is possible that the boy worked where his father had once looked down at a line painted on a concrete lot and considered the distance between one kind of order and another. The Autobahn continued to be his line of sight. In 1954, a new stretch reopened after repair. In 1957, a bridge looped across the Fulda, sleek and concrete like a promise. He would take his hours and go on walks and find a place under a bridge to lie with his back against the cool cement and listen to cars. He would notice the design of the new Mercedes and the sound of the Opel and the way the engines had a different kind of hunger. He would measure his heartbeat against the rush and the rhythm and note that some math inside him was still trying to balance an equation that had too many variables for a human to hold. In 1958, an Allied intelligence summary from the U.S. High Commission in Germany noted, "Public opinion in Hesse displays a desire to put the past aside in favor of economic improvement. Discussion of war crimes remains limited to intellectual circles." The report used the phrase "fatigue of conscience." The fatigue could be heard in churches and in union halls and in the long sighs of men at counters who wanted to speak of football and not of counters who wanted to speak of football and not of camps. In 1959, a Bundesarchiv memo warns that files are consumed by the rearrangement of personnel and that important documentation may be lost between institutions. The mathematics of memory depends upon filing systems working. It also depends upon the willingness of people to consult them. When the Frankfurt Auschwitz trials began in 1963, Karl was in his 50s. He read the news in the Hessisch Niedersächsische Allgemeine. He read quotes from survivors in a typeface that made them smaller than the photographs of a car that had gone off a road. He read the names of men who had lived in hidden daylight for 20 years. He read the testimony of a railway clerk who described timetables and numbers. His job had made him intimate with timetables. He lit a cigarette and knew what a list of numbers can do to a person's sleep. Students marched in 1968 and asked questions that had been deferred. They asked their professors about their fathers. They asked their fathers about their fathers. They asked their mothers where they had been. They asked themselves why an idea could fit so easily into a skull, and why a skull could accommodate so much pressure. They threw tomatoes. They published pamphlets. They sat in offices with men like Karl, who had been born in the years when everything was made of horsehair, and who now signed documents authorizing a new, prefabricated housing block. He wrote that year, "They say that one cannot raise a building on a grave." He wrote, "But we have done it, and sometimes it stands." He later tidied his notebooks into a small bundle. He did not intend anyone to read them. He wrote for himself and also for an imaginary court that would one day ask him to add up his life. He understood that the mathematics would include items not strictly numerical. He began to write in the present tense when he felt the past rising like a temperature. He wrote, "I am standing on the Autobahn. I am seeing a small truck carrying cows. I am smelling the tar. I am knowing that I am alive because the cold makes my fingers ache and because my shame feels like winter." In the town, streets were renamed again and again. In 1945, Hindenburgstrasse became Oberste Gasse. In 1946, Adolf Hitler Platz became Friedrichsplatz again. In 1950, the government building on a corner hosted an exhibition of abstract paintings called Documenta. People went and stood in front of shapes that did not pretend to be trees. They felt called by something new and disappointed by something they could not name. In 1964, they went again. They said they did not understand. The ununderstood can sometimes be a refuge. He watched an expellee family he had once housed move into a new flat on the 3rd floor of a building with balconies and geraniums. He watched the woman who had told stories of the Oder hang sheets on a line and sing. He watched the daughter walk in a short skirt and laugh. He watched a policeman who had on